Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining. We're just about to start the Parsha of Sarah, which is a fascinating Parsha. It's a little bit unusual. It's not what we would usually expect within a Parsha. A lot of strange things, and we're going to discuss that and hopefully shed some light. So in short, Sarah means the life of Sarah. And surprisingly, perhaps, the story begins with the death of Sarah. So the first verse is the days of Sarah, the life of Sarah was 127 years. And then it says the second verse is Sarah passed away, Tamat Sarah. So it's almost ironic that the name of the parsha that whose name it is, the parsha whose name is the life of Sarah, really discusses the aftermath of the passing of Sarah. But that's part of the discussion which we're going to get to. But we will begin, as is our custom, with the parsha in a nutshell. I'm going to share the screen. We have upgraded technology here. So here we go. It's a relatively short nutshell, but it's a very long parsha. The reason why it's such a long parsha, and this is part of what makes this parsha so strange, is that this parsha is the most repetitive parsha in the Torah. We have a story. We have how the story was repeated multiple times. Different parts of the story were repeated in different contexts, as we will see. So the beginning of the parsha, Chayei Sarah, the life of Sarah, the nutshell reads, Sarah dies at age 127 and is buried in the Machpelah cave in Hebron. So Machpelah, if you want to see a picture of Machpelah cave, you just look for our friend Andrew Wells. He's here on the screen. And right behind him is the picture of the building that's built on top of the cave of Machpelah, the double cave. Machpelah means double. Hopefully we'll discuss that a little bit from the Kabbalistic perspective, the meaning of the double. What is a double cave? But in any case, she's buried in the cave of Machpelah in Hebron, which Abraham purchases from Ephron the Hittite for 400 shekels of silver. You have the first description of a real estate negotiation, and first time we read about Abraham taking possession of real estate, and we get an intrinsic discussion of the actual negotiation. So if you want to invest in real estate, this may be, you may want to learn from Abraham how to negotiate. The first Jew negotiating for the first piece of land. In any case, that's the beginning of the parsha, and then the entire rest of the parsha is a story about finding a wife for Isaac. Abraham's servant Eliezer is sent, laden with gifts to Haran to find a wife for Isaac. Where is Haran? Haran is the place where Abraham left 2 parshas ago. When he was 75 years old, God tells Abraham, leave your birthplace, leave your father's home, and go to the land that I will show you. So Abraham leaves Haran, journeys to Israel. Now the journey goes back the other way. Now what's happening is Abraham sends his servant to go to Haran to find a wife for Isaac. At the village well, Eliezer asks God for a sign. When the maidens come to the well, he will ask for some water to drink. The woman who will offer to give his camels to drink as well shall be the one destined for his master's son. So Eliezer is not looking for any other qualities. He doesn't want to see her SAT scores. He doesn't want to see her report cards. All he's looking for is kindness. That's really what he's looking for. And therefore, the test of kindness is he will ask her for water if she will give water to him, but not only to him, but also to his camels. Then we know that she is the one destined for Isaac. Rebecca, the daughter of Abraham's nephew Bethuel, appears at the well and passes the test. Eliezer is invited to their home, where he repeats the story of the day's events. So again, we read the entire story to begin with. Now we read how Eliezer repeats that story to the family. Rebecca returns with Eliezer to the land of Canaan, where they encounter Isaac praying in the field. Isaac marries Rebecca, loves her, and is comforted over the loss of his mother. That's the bulk of the parsha. The purchasing of the cave of Machpelah is one reading in the beginning, and then you have most of the parsha, and at the end we have we go back to Abraham. Abraham takes a new wife, Keturah. He marries a new wife. Sarah passes away, marries a new wife. The rabbis, and you see in this little nutshell here, the rabbi, they put in brackets that it's Hagar, because the rabbis explain that Keturah is not another woman. It's actually the woman he was married to earlier, Hagar, the mother of his son Ishmael, who was sent away. Now Abraham marries her again and fathers 6 additional sons, but Isaac is designated as the only heir. Abraham dies at age 175 and is buried beside Sarah by his 2 eldest sons, Isaac and Ishmael. So in some sense, the Parsha concludes with what it began. It began with the story of the purchase of the cave of Machpelah, and it also concludes with the story of how Abraham himself is buried in the cave which he purchased for Sarah. And the burial is performed by Isaac and Ishmael. Isaac first, Ishmael second, which is significant. Hopefully we'll get to that as well. Okay, so that's the story in short. If anybody has any comments, questions, or you want to discuss a specific aspect of the Parsha, then please go ahead. Otherwise, we begin the journey.
Rabbi, how do they conclude that Hagar is katura?
How do they conclude that Hagar is katura? That is a good question. They really want to say so. They really, really want to say so. Why do they really want to say so? First of all, what does katura mean? So katura comes from the word ketoret. Ketoret is the incense that was offered in the temple. So ketoret represents a very high level, because when we get to the 3rd book of the Torah, we're going to start reading about the offerings. And in addition to the offerings, there's also the incense. And the incense produces a pleasing aroma, produces smell. And the incense is considered much more spiritual than the actual offerings, which is more like food. So ketoret, the offering of the incense, is considered the most spiritual service in the temple. This name that this woman has, Keturah, that she becomes like, her name is Keturah, really comes from the word ketoret. So the sages say the reason why we refer to her as Keturah, really she's Hagar, but the reason why she's referred to as Keturah is because Na'im ma'aseha kitoret. Her actions are as beautiful as the incense. In other words, the name change in the Bible, a name change represents a change in character, a transformation in character. So we want to say that this was Hagar, but instead of Hagar being the one who was expelled from Abraham's house because of the dispute with Sarah, in other words, we can elaborate, but the point over there was that Hagar felt that Ishmael, her son, would be the heir of Abraham, and in reality, it was not meant to be. So, and she would not concede to Isaac's superiority, so she was expelled. But then the name change represents transformation. So the transformation is now she's as beautiful as Ketoret as the incense. Now I just want to get, so this is not directly related to your question. This is just the name change. But to your question, the way the Rebbe explained your question is, the rabbis really want to say that this is Hagar. Why? Because Hagar, Abraham was influencing everybody. He influenced his children. He influenced his household. He influenced his servants. We see that in last Parsha. We see it in this Parsha as well. So Abraham is this person who is very charismatic and has an influence on everybody. There's only one person Abraham doesn't influence. That's his wife Hagar. Because last week it says that she was expelled. And it says she went and got lost in the desert of Beersheba. And the sages say, when it says she got lost, it wasn't just geographical, it was also a spiritual. She went back to the idol worship of her parents' home. In other words, because once she left Abraham's home, she sort of removed herself from the influence of Abraham. So now we see that Abraham is this person who's really taking responsibility, not only for his family, but not only for his direct family, but for her surroundings. And he's teaching justice to the entire society. Okay, wonderful. You're very good. You're teaching the rest of society, but what about your own household? If Hagar was not affected, then it's almost like a blemish on Abraham's legacy, because he can't influence the people who are closest to him. So that's why when we conclude the Torah, we conclude the life of Abraham. Abraham passes away in this week's Parsha. We conclude the life of Abraham, we come full circle, says, don't worry, reader, don't worry. Abraham did end up influencing not only Ishmael, which is written explicitly in the verse. Ishmael came back. And I alluded to it before, but we saw in the nutshell that it says that after Abraham passes away, Isaac and Yishmael buried him. So the Torah emphasizes Isaac first. So Rashi says this teaches that Yishmael repented. What does it mean Yishmael repented? He allowed Isaac to go first because the order of the verse is also significant. So when the verse says Isaac and Yishmael buried him, even though Yishmael is older, but it says Isaac buried him. Isaac buried him first. So Yishmael acknowledges that Isaac is even not physically older, but he's older in the sense that he's the heir because he is the son of the primary wife of Sarah. So we see there that Yishmael does teshuvah. Yishmael repents and understands his proper place in Abraham's house, which will allow him to be part of the Abrahamic story, of the teachings of monotheism. And believe me, Yishmael did a lot to spread monotheism, because now I know the Islam doesn't have the best rap right now, but look historically, they did a tremendous amount to teach about the unity of God, and it's not so well known, but a lot of our ideas of understanding of the unity of God came from Maimonides. And don't tell. The fact of the matter is that Maimonides learned a lot of his philosophy about the unity of God from Muslims. So they had a tremendous contribution to the idea of the unity of God. Nevertheless, Yishmael is not Abraham's heir, it's Isaac. And we can explain that. We can talk about it, how come that is. Maybe we'll talk about it. But the point is, Yishmael recognizes that. And when Yishmael recognizes that, then he can come back to Abraham's house and be part of the Abraham story. So that's written almost explicitly in the Torah, because the Torah says Yishmael buried his father, and Isaac and Yishmael buried their father, which means they put Isaac first. Here, but Hagar's gone. Where is Hagar? So that's why the moment we find a woman, Abraham goes again and marries another woman, the rabbis have an incentive to say this is Hagar, because now Hagar also comes back to Abraham's story. And this would be characteristic with Abraham. It's hard to believe that Abraham would let Hagar drift away, not just physically from his home, but also from his influence. So it's much more pleasant to interpret the verse as Abraham somehow influences her to come back to his household. So that is the short answer to Ken's point.
Thank you.
Okay, let's read a little bit. Let's start with the first story. Whenever we don't know what to do, we try to go in order. So let's read a little bit about the history of the purchase of the cave of Machpelah, the double cave that was in Hebron, and which Abraham buries Sarah in that location. And there's also a lot of this Torah is repetitive. It could have just said Abraham went and bought the land, bought the cave for 400 shekel, which was a lot of money, as we will see. But the question here becomes, why do I need all the intricacy of all the back and forth of the negotiation? And of course, the Torah is not just telling us how to buy real estate, even though maybe it's telling us that as well, but there's tremendous amount of insight, both political and spiritual, in the way the Torah tells the story, in the messages that the Torah is going to convey. So what we want to do is we want to track, just for a few minutes, we'll track a little bit, we'll share the screen, we'll follow the discussion, and we'll see what the Torah is really alluding to. Now I'm going to give you a spoiler alert. Before we read the verses inside, I'm going to show you what I'm trying to look out for. So what I'm trying to look out for is that Abraham is buying the land. He wants the land of a very specific individual. There's a guy named Ephron, son of Tzochar. He's got a piece of land. Abraham wants this land. But Abraham doesn't really negotiate with him. Abraham negotiates with the whole tribe. They call it Bnei Chet, the children of Chet. So it seems like before even he can negotiate about the specific piece of land, he has to go to the town hall and get permission just to buy into this neighborhood, right? Think about it as a covenant. They have a covenant. If a tribe lives here, we're just not letting strangers in. So he has to negotiate with the people of Chet, and once he finishes negotiating with people of Chet, he will see. Then he says, "I want this specific field," and then they negotiate with the specific owner. But what emerges from all of this, from this back and forth, as we will see, is that it's clear that the people have tremendous respect for Abraham. They refer to him as Nasi Elohim, you're the Prince of God. And what they also want to do is they want to give him the land for free. So they want to do. They want to give him a burial land for free. And Abraham insists that he doesn't want it for free, he wants to pay. And even after he identifies which specific field he wants, the gentleman says, okay, between me and you, we're such good friends, I'll give you 400, it's a land worth 400 coins. But for us, it's no big deal, I'll give it to you for free. And there's almost a resistance for them to give him the land, to sell him the land. They're happy to give it, they don't want to sell. Only when Abraham persists and insists that he's not taking the land as a gift, only then do they agree to sell. So we want to think about what that means and why, and what's the significance of that. Again, both as from the political perspective, but also from the spiritual perspective. So we'll do a little bit of both. I'm going to share this screen. Here is Abraham. I'm turning to the people of Chet and saying, could you please sell me a piece of land? So I'm reading verse 3. And Abraham arose from before his dead, and he spoke to the sons of Chet, saying, I am a stranger and an inhabitant with you. Give me a burial property with you, so that I might bury my dead before me. And the sons of Chet answered Abraham, saying to him, listen to us, my Lord. You are a prince of God in our midst. I'm reading verse 6. You're the prince of God. In the choicest of our graves, bury your dead. None of us will withhold his grave from you to bury your dead. Just take the best one. Everybody will give it to you. Nobody will hold back. You say, Abraham, why not? That's a good deal. But the price is right. It's for free. But Abraham doesn't want the free stuff. So, and Abraham arose and prostrated himself to the people of the land, to the sons of Chet. And he spoke with them, saying, if it is your will that I bury my dead from before me, listen to me and entreat for me to Ephron, the son of Zohar, that he may give me the Machpelah, which means double, cave, which belongs to him, which is at the end of his field. For a full price, let him give it to me in your midst for burial property. What does he want? He wants full price. He wants to pay full price. Ephron doesn't want to give. He wants to give it. He doesn't want to pay for full price. So where are we? We're verse 10. Now Ephron was sitting in the midst of the sons of Chet, and Ephron the Hittite answered Abraham in the hearing of the sons of Chet. In other words, the negotiation, it's not just a private negotiation between Abraham and Ephron, but it's in the presence of all the people of Chet. It's in the town square. Everyone's listening in to this negotiation, which means everybody has stake in this negotiation, as we will explain. Abraham, he says, no. Verse 11, no, my Lord, listen to me. I have given you the field and the cave that is in it. I have given it to you before the eyes of the sons of the people. I have given it to you, bury your dead. In other words, he's saying, take it for free. And Abraham prostrated himself before the people of the land. And he spoke to Ephron in the hearing of the people of the land, saying, but if only you would listen to me, I am giving the money for the field. Take it from me, and I will bury my dead there. And Ephron replied to Abraham, saying, my Lord, listen to me, a piece of land with 400 shekels of silver. What is it between me and you? In other words, I don't need 400. I don't need this land. I'll give it to you. It's only worth 400 shekels of silver, which was a tremendous amount of money, as the Talmud points out. So he's being subtle. Now, finally, he wants the money. So he names the price, but he's being passive aggressive. He doesn't say, okay, I'm billing you 400 coins of silver. He says, no, he says, this is a land worth 400 coins of silver. I can give it to you for free, right? But he named his price. Oh, you named your price, so Abraham gives him the money. So that's verse 16. And Abraham listened to Ephron, and Abraham weighed out to Ephron the silver that he had named in the hearing of the sons of Chet, 400 shekels of silver accepted by the merchant. In other words, it was a good currency that was easy to trade. In those days, today you have the dollar, maybe the euro. I don't know if people like to trade in today. But in those days, you have different types of coins. Every coin has a different value, not just in how much it's worth, but how easy it is to spend. So Abraham gives him the best coins over la secher, the pass to the merchant. Okay, this is a lot of extra words here. In other words, seemingly the Torah teaches us. The Torah speaks very concisely. The Torah teaches us many laws, important laws, with just adding one little letter. And here you have the back and forth in the negotiation. And when you sense it, you see resistance. They don't want to sell. He wants to buy. They want to give. He doesn't want to take. So what's happening here? So I'll first give the political interpretation, then we give the spiritual interpretation. The political interpretation is very simple. They're happy to honor him. They're happy to give him a place to bury his dead. That's not a problem. They don't want to sell it to him. They don't want to give him deed. because in those days, in that culture, if you sell land to somebody, you're giving him legitimacy to live in that land. In other words, it's not just you're saying you can use the land, but you have title to the land, which means you belong here. You're not a foreigner that is benefiting from the kindness of the locals and the natives. But if we sell you the land, if the people of Chet agree, in other words, it's not just a simple transaction. The commentaries explain, Nachmanides explains, that they would never sell land to a foreigner unless the whole town agrees, right? That's why the negotiation is not just with this gentleman Ephron. It's actually a negotiation with the whole town, because the people of Chet, the entire tribe, has to agree to sell land to a foreigner, because selling land to a foreigner is a political statement. It's saying that you belong here. You're not a foreigner, you're a native. And that is something they were hesitant to do, but ultimately they agreed to do. And that's what the story, and that's why the story is so important, showing the people's recognition, not just that Abraham is a nice guy and we have to treat him well, and he's a kind person, so we're going to honor him by giving him a free piece of land, but acknowledging that this is his land because ultimately God promised him this land, and ultimately he's going to get that land. So that is the political interpretation from Nachmanides of what the resistance was. And now there's also a spiritual dimension, and the spiritual dimension is actually more relevant to us, because the political angle doesn't really apply to us. Today you can go, thank God we live in America, you can even buy land in Greenwich. Could you imagine? Even if you're a Jew, you could buy land in Greenwich. You don't need the whole town to agree. No more covenants that I know of. Maybe there is, but I don't think so. And you can buy land anywhere, believe it or not. You can even buy land, you could buy land anywhere, even for a Chabad house, believe it or not. So the point here is, so that's not so relevant to us. But the spiritual interpretation is very relevant to us. What's the spiritual interpretation? Spiritual interpretation is like this. They're very happy to give Abraham, to give him a plot of land to bury his dead. Why not? They don't want to sell. Why don't they want to sell? It's a philosophical point here. What's the philosophical point? If you sell land to Abraham, that Abraham is a landowner. What happens if Abraham's a landowner? Then he gets a vote in the town council. Right? Next time you have to sell land to somebody, you call the people, all the local landowners. Abraham's a landowner. If he's a landowner, then he's a taxpayer. If he's a taxpayer, then he gets a say in all the matters of the town. He gets to say when they collect the garbage. He gets to say when they plow the snow. I mean, there's no snow in Hebron. Sometimes there's snow in Hebron, but he gets to say in the economy and in the life and in the society of the town. Now, those people don't like this idea, not because they don't like Abraham, because their idea of what Abraham is, of what a spiritual person is completely different than Abraham's. Their idea of a spiritual person is, if you're a spiritual person, you belong in the study hall. You belong in the woods meditating. You have no business telling people how to run their daily life. You have no business trying to tell people how to influence society. So they understand that there are priests. They understood there are spiritual people. 2 weeks ago, we read in Lech Lecha that there was a fellow named Malki Tzedek Melech Shalem. There was Ru Kohen. There was a priest to God, and he lived in this area called Shalem, which is probably Jerusalem. Which at the time, Jerusalem was a little dot on the map. It was just like a tower or something. It wasn't a big city, because we understand we need a spiritual leader, but the spiritual leader should not influence how we run our town, when we take etc., how we interact with other people. In other words, don't let the spirituality affect real life decisions. And Abraham says, no, if I'm living here, if I'm taking possession of land, I need to be able, I believe that a spiritual person has a responsibility to influence every area of life. The culture, the economy, commerce, everything. And therefore he says, no, I don't want to be a guest here. I want to have a voice, but not just a voice in how to live a spiritual life, but a voice in how to influence the real world. And that is Abraham's way, and that's the Jewish way. The Jewish way of spirituality is we want to vote. We want to vote. I don't just mean a vote in the election, but I mean that too. But I mean, we want to say, we want our Judaism to affect our real life, our Judaism to affect how we do business. It's not that we have this dichotomy that once a week or once a year or once a day we go to shul, and then that is separate, compartmentalized, and separate from the rest of our life. No, a Jew is like Abraham, and Abraham says, I'm buying land, I'm a landowner, I have influence and say in how we should live in this real world, because that's the idea of spirituality from the perspective of the Jew, not to retreat from the material, but to influence it. So now we understand why this is such an important part of the story, because this is not just telling us how Abraham buys a piece of land, but it's telling us how we live our life. So that's step one in the journey about what's happening with the cave of Machpelah. And a lot more to say, but we have to continue. Okay. Anyone has any comments, questions, jokes, rebuttals, anything else? We'd love to hear.
Rabbi, do we know why Abraham wanted the cave of Machpelah?
Yeah. So, I forgot to tell you how to negotiate real estate. Abraham wants the cave of Machpelah. Why that is, we'll discuss in a moment. But Abraham is a smart guy. And when you want to buy real estate, this is what you do. First of all, you don't show enthusiasm. You don't say, I love this piece of property. Every ounce of enthusiasm you show, the price goes up, right? So that's very a good piece of advice. When we were going to buy our house in Greenwich with the help of God, so my mother came to see it, and she saw it, and I was like, Mom, this house is amazing. She pulls me to the other room and she says, no, don't show any enthusiasm. The more enthusiasm you show, the higher the price is going to be. So if you look at the story, you see that Abraham does not mention what he wants a specific field. Abraham says, I want a field amongst you. Doesn't say which one. Only later in the negotiation does he slip. He says, oh, I want this field also, right? So he doesn't show any enthusiasm for this specific land. But according to the Torah, according to the Medrash, Abraham wants a specific land because this specific land has tremendous significance, both historical and spiritual. And we're going to try to explain what the spiritual significance is. It's a little hard because it's very Kabbalistic. I'm trying to make sure I understand it, and if I can find the words to convey it, but we'll try. I'll make an attempt. I wasn't going to talk about it, but thanks to Andy and the cave of Machpelah, that keeps jumping out at me. So I think we have to give it a little bit of attention today. So the first thing we say, the Talmud says, the Medrash says that the cave of Machpelah is the place of the burial of Abraham, of Adam and Eve. So it wasn't just, so we think of it as the cave of the patriarchs and matriarchs, because Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, and Jacob and Leah were buried there. So that's 3 couples, but there are really 4 couples. And the first couple is Abraham and is Adam and Eve. That's the tradition. How Abraham knew about it, I don't know, but he knew. And the presumption is that the other people did not know. That's the presumption. And the Zohar gives this whole story that Abraham went into the cave once. And I think I remember, I can't say 100%, but I think I remember that this happened as a result of Abraham inviting guests. In other words, Abraham was trying to invite guests, and according to the Zohar, what happens is that he was trying to get the animal to slaughter for the guests, and the animal ran into the cave, and Abraham runs after the animal into the cave, and that he senses the holiness of Adam and Eve in that space. That's the Medrash and the Zohar. So therefore, he wants that space for himself, and he buys it for Sarah. That's what the Medrash says. Medrash, Zohar. And that's the significance of that cave. But now let's see if we can drill a little deeper, a little bit more Kabbalistic. If anyone is we'll try to do a little more Kabbalistic. And I'll try to do this. Okay, I'll give you a little Kabbalistic interpretation and then maybe try to explain it in simpler terms. So the word means Ma'arat HaMachpelah, the double cave. Why is it a double cave? So we'll discuss what double cave means in a minute. But the Medrash says that the cave is unique. Not only is the burial place of Abraham, of Adam and Eve, which is true, but that represents something deeper. That's what the Medrash calls, it's the opening to heaven. So what does it mean it's the opening to heaven? It's the gates of heaven. If you want to go to heaven, you have to go through Hebron. What does that mean? It means that specific land is somehow a combination of heaven and earth. In other words, the energy that you sense when you're in that space, when you're in that cave, you feel the energy of earth, but it's easier to access the energy of heaven. So that's the simple meaning what double cave is. What does it mean that it's double? What does it mean it's a double cave? So we'll talk about it in a minute. What was two stories or one room within another room? We'll get to that in a minute. But just the simple meaning, Ma'arat Machpelah, the double cave. Double means there are two dimensions. So when you're in that space, you're not in one dimension, you're in two dimensions. In other words, two dimensions, it means there's two dimensions of space that you're in. You're in physical space, but you're also in spiritual space. So you're on earth and in heaven together in that space. That's the meaning of it. The Zohar says it's the opening to Eden. What does it mean? It's the opening to Eden. So Eden, as we know, is the Garden of Eden, which is from the book of Genesis, from the story of Genesis, the garden, the pleasant, tranquil garden where Adam and Eve lived when they were created and lived in peace and tranquility. But that's only a physical manifestation of a spiritual idea. Spiritual idea is Gan Eden. Paradise is a spiritual reality where the presence of God is felt, and therefore there's everything is good. It's bliss. So the cave of Machpelah, that's where the soul goes in the afterlife. But the cave of the Machpelah is the place, the physical place on earth that somehow captures, has a double dimension because it has a dimension of heaven and earth together in one place. That is the significance of Marat Machpelah, the cave of Machpelah, the double cave in a simple sense. Now you want to get Kabbalistic. Kabbalistic is, there's this, I'm just going to put it out here, but it's a little bit complex, so I'm not going to fully explain it. Kabbalistically, there's 4 letters of God's name, Yud, He, Vav, He. And those 4 letters are unique because each one represents a specific energy. Now, there's one letter, in those 4 letters, there's one letter that's double, Yud, He, Vav, He. So there are 2 He's. Okay, so Marat Machpelah, there are 2 He's. And from the Kabbalistic perspective, most of our life, we live in the energy of the lower He. The lower He, the final letter of God's name, is the energy that comes into the world to revive the world. It's called Malchut, the attribute of kingship. That's the lower dimension of life that we get from God. We are not capable of feeling the higher He. The higher dimension, higher He represents not Malchut, but Bina, awareness. The awareness of God that we don't really feel in this world. We feel the actions of God. We see God's creative powers. We see nature. That's God's action. That's the lower He. The higher He is the awareness of God. It's called Bina, wisdom, understanding, and that we're not able to possess until we get to the afterlife. But again, says the Kabbalah, says this is from the Zohar. The double cave represents double He. If you're in that space, you get not only the lower He, not only do you sense God's actions, but you also sense the awareness of the presence of God, the wisdom and understanding and the perspective of God, and that's the higher He. So that is, in the language of the Kabbalah, the He's. We're not going to elaborate upon that too much, but I'm going to say one more, maybe another minute or two on the cave of Machpelah, and then we move on to the story that takes up most of the space of the Parsha, which is the story of finding a wife for Isaac. But one more word on the double cave. So the double cave, what does double cave represent? So why is it called a double cave? So Rashi quotes the Talmud and says there are 2 interpretations. One interpretation is that it's called a double cave because there's Bait V'Aliyah al Gabav. It's one floor with another, with a floor on top of it. In other words, it's a 2-floor cave. And there's a whole teaching of the Rebbe that it's not really 2-floor caves, it's 2-floor home. But I'm not going to get into that. Let's say the simple meaning is it's 2 floors, 2-floor cave. So in other words, it's not a single cave, it's a double cave, one on top of the other. That's one interpretation. Another interpretation, says the Talmud, it's not one on top of the other, but it's one within another. In other words, there are 2 chambers. You go into the outer chamber, and then from the outer chamber, you go into the inner chamber. So it's a double cave, even physically, not just spiritually, as I was talking before, but even physically. It's either one on top of the other or one within another. That's the double dimension of the cave. So based on what the Zohar says, there are later Hasidic commentaries that explain it in a way that's a little bit easier to apply, and I'm going to quote them. I'm specifically quoting the Sfat Emet, who was a great Hasidic master, and he was he was from the Hasidic dynasty called Gur or Ger, I guess you could say. And at some point in Poland, they were the biggest Hasidic group ever. They're pretty big now in Israel as well, but in Poland before the war, they were tremendous. In any case, so the Sfas Emes says as follows. He says that there are 2 dimensions to the doubleness of the cave. It's one on top of the other or one within another. And that represents, why does Abraham want that space? Because that's a spiritual space. And Abraham and Sarah lived their life in the model. They were a physical manifestation of the double cave. So the double cave represents where they're buried. Why are they buried there? Because that's the way they lived. What does it mean that's the way they lived? What does it mean they lived in double dimension? So there's we have to live, a Jew, or really a human being, is a hybrid. He has both body and soul. So we have to live in a double dimension. What's the double dimension? Number one, the first interpretation is, it's two stories. We're living in two-story existence, not just one story, not one floor, but two floors. In other words, we have our physical existence the way it is down here, but we also have our source, the spiritual source. Our soul is not really a member of this earth. Our soul is really a spiritual creature, a spiritual creation. And what our soul wants, our soul doesn't want physical food and physical shelter. What our soul wants is spirituality, relationship with God. So when we navigate through life, we're navigating it's really a double dimension. If we're tuned into our core, we're really traveling on both levels. We're living a two-story life. The lower story is our physical needs, our physical life, and then above that is our spiritual life. And Abraham and Sarah embody this doubleness, and therefore when they pass away, there's actually the cave, which is two caves, one on top of the other, emphasizing this double dimension. Now, you go a little deeper. The second interpretation in the Talmud is not that it's one on top of the other, it's one within another. Right? So you have one cave, and then within, you have one cave. You walk into the cave, there's an outer room, and then there's the inner room. That's the doubleness, not one on top of the other, but one within. In other words, one deeper than the next. The same thing is in our life. If you're in touch with the dimension that's above, if you realize that you're not only a body, but you also have a soul, if you realize that you don't only have a physical life, but on top of it, you have a spiritual life. So now you're sort of aware of the multidimensional hierarchy, so to speak, one on top of the other. Then you also have the capacity to be multidimensional in the sense that you can always go deeper. So not flying to heaven, but also in the earth, in every area you are, there's the outer chamber, the inner chamber. The outer chamber is the physical manifestation, the way the thing looks, but the inner dimension, the inner room, is the soul of that experience. So in other words, once you realize that I'm not just physical, I also have a spiritual soul, and my soul, the way it is in heaven, is above the way it is down here. So there are two dimensions, one on top of the other. Then when I interact with a physical activity or with another person or everything in this life, I'm not just looking at the external dimension. I'm looking at the inner essence of each dimension. In other words, each person, when I see you, I don't just see your body, I see your soul. When I see an experience, I don't just see the physical experience, I see the inner energy. So I see a tuna sandwich. It's not just food that gives me nourishment, physically speaking, but it also has a spark of God waiting to be elevated. And it's not just in people, it's not just in food, but it's in every experience. You could look at the external, you could look at the internal. And that's the dimension of the house within the house, meaning there's an outer chamber and an inner chamber. And you have a choice. Where am I living my life? Am I living my life in the outer chamber or in the inner chamber? What's the answer? You have to live your life both. But to be able to see the soul in another person or in another experience, you have to be able to realize that there's also a soul on top of you. There's me, the physical me, and then there's me, the way my soul is in heaven. That's my true identity. So when you have the two buildings, one on top of the other, then you can get the two chambers, one within the other. So that's the Kabbalistic interpretation of what the cave of Machpelah is. I hope this is somewhat interesting. But it's interesting how the double cave can actually, both interpretations could work. It could say, according to the Kabbalistic interpretation, they're both true. It was a cave one on top of the other plus one within another. The question is why it's named. So that interpreted double could be both dimensions, but I believe that one dimension is dependent on the other dimension. The only way I'll see the soul within somebody else, the only way I see the inner dimension within a specific experience is if I could see that I too have two dimensions. I too have me down here and my soul the way it is in its source. And if there's two dimensions, one on top of the other, then there'll be two dimensions, one within the other. That's the story in short of the cave of Machpelah. If anyone has any comments, please share. Tell me that you understand what I said, or tell me you have no idea what I said, or tell me that what I said sounds interesting, but it's just too lofty. Whatever you want to say, I want to hear, and then we move to the next story.
Thank you. That was a fascinating answer.
Thank you, Andy.
Very much so. Just going back to the political part, isn't that part important because it relates to our claim to the land today?
Oh, the Medrash says that there are three parts of the land of Israel that the Gentiles do not have any claim against our ownership. In other words, we own the entirety of Israel. And what's why do we own the entirety of Israel? So there are all kinds of theories of ownership. If you know, if you study the philosophy of the economy, of philosophy of ownership in the 18th century, we go 17th century, we get all kinds of theories. And we're not going to get into all those details right now, but the bottom line is that one way of ownership is conquest. If you conquer something, it becomes yours. But conquest has a certain weakness, because the ownership is not the most wholesome way of possessing ownership, because it's being taken by force. So even though legally, not just legally, legally, conquest is one form of ownership, but it's not the most wholesome form of ownership. What's the most wholesome form of ownership? The most wholesome form of ownership is buying something. When you buy something, you pay money, and the owner accepts the money in return. So there's, I see some lawyers here. It's called, what is it called? It skips my mind. What's it called when I want the piece of land? I'm giving. What's the legal
Consideration.
Word? Consideration. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Warren. Yes. So you get a consideration if the owner is receiving some consideration, receiving something in actual in return, then that's more wholesome. The problem is that when I buy from you, I'm only buying your specific ownership, but there's also the government owns this land. That's why the government has the right to tax. So there's layers of ownership. Therefore, the best way of ownership legally is if I conquer it from you. In other words, I buy it from you, but I also conquer it. So I buy it from you as the specific ownership, and I conquer it means I have also the collective ownership, the government ownership. So without getting into detail here, there are 3 places in the Torah that the Jewish people conquered, but they were not satisfied with the conquest, and they actually wanted to pay. This is the first case. The second case is the burial place of Joseph. There, it says that Abraham, when Jacob came back from when Jacob came back from being 20 years in Haran, he buys a piece of land. And later in the Torah, it says that he gives it to Joseph for a burial spot. That's the second place. And the third place is the Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is already way later. The Jewish people conquered the entire region. And yet, when David wanted to make the place for an altar for God, and ultimately Solomon built the temple there, David did not want to rely on the ownership of conquest. He wanted that because even that takes care of the collective ownership, but he wanted also the specific ownership of the specific owner to have to hand that over to the Jewish people. So he goes to the guy, his name was Aravna, and there was a threshing floor. That's where he used to thresh his grain. And he tells Aravna, I want to buy it from you. I'll pay you full price. And he paid an exorbitant amount. I think it was, I don't remember, 600-700 shekel. I don't remember how much exactly. And those are the 3 places where the Torah says, where the rabbis point out that there's no claim, because not only do we have conquest, but the owner actually sold it to us. Now it's ironic that those are the 3 places that that our ownership is the most contested: Temple Mountain, Hebron, and unfortunately the cave of Joseph we gave back from the conquest of 1967. Unfortunately, but it's just interesting. It's not just the physical place of where we're fighting about. It represents the spiritual conflict of who does the land belong to, meaning whose energy permeates the land. And to be able to really conquer Israel, you have to get in touch with the energy of Hebron, Jerusalem, and Shechem, and that is a lot to talk about. But yes, that's solidifying our ownership, which is why the people of Chet, which is going back to Nachmanides' point, Elisa, which is why the people of Chet say, yeah, we'll give you whatever you want, but we're not selling it to you. Selling it to you represents ownership, and they resisted that. But ultimately, we still have the deed. The deed is the Bible. We read it every Saturday. We're going to read it this Saturday. So we have the deed for the purchase of the Cave of Machpelah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Okay, we have a few minutes left to discuss the main story. I don't even know where to begin. There's too much to talk about. Part of the question is, why is the story so drawn out? The story is a very simple story. Abraham wants, for whatever reason, we're not going to have time to get into that today, but Abraham does not want his son marrying one of the local girls. He wants him to go back to the land which he left from, which is strange. If it was so bad that he had to leave, why does he want to go back? Whatever the case is, he dispatches his servant And his servant goes, and his servant finds the girl. He prays to God. He says, I'm gonna make a test. I'm gonna ask a girl to give me water. If she gives me water and my camels, then she's the one, and everything is fine. And it all happens, and everything is repeated. And that's when the story, and everything is repeated, and then they come back and they get married. But you could say the story much shorter. You don't need all those verses. So the sages already realized that there's a problem. There's something strange, something so out of character to the Torah to give us such an elaboration on a story, which it could have said in a fraction of the verses. So the rabbis point this out, but they don't explain. So I'm just going to quote what the rabbis say, and then that itself needs to be deciphered. Say the rabbis, the stories of the servants of the patriarchs are more beautiful than the Torah of the children. Why? Because the portion of Eliezer is the servant that was dispatched, the servant of Abraham, not the son of Abraham, the servant of Abraham was dispatched to find the wife for Isaac. The portion of Eliezer was repeated in the Torah, was said in the Torah multiple times. And many laws of the Torah were only alluded to. You don't even get one word, you get one letter. Okay? So the sages point this out. They say there's something unique about the story of Eliezer, about the stories of the servants of the patriarchs, that is actually, in some ways, it's actually more important than the Torah itself and the law of the children. Children meaning the children of Israel. So that's pointing out, that's drawing our attention to the problem, but it's not necessarily explaining why that is. And there's all kinds of interpretations. We'll start with the easy ones, then we get to the more Kabbalistic ones. The easy one is like this. There's a statement in the Ethics of the Fathers that says, Derech Eretz Kadma la Torah. Derech Eretz could mean multiple things. It's the way of the land. So way of the land can mean all different things. But in this context is to be a good person precedes the Torah. Before you can start saying, I'm going to be a spiritual person, I'm going to keep all the mitzvot, be a mensch, be a good person, be a nice person. That's the foundation. If that's the case, maybe this is what the Torah is telling us. Because what does the story of the story highlight? It highlights Rebekah's kindness. And what we're saying is that Rebekah's kindness is in some ways more important than the laws of the Torah. Why is it more important? Not because it's more important, because that's the foundation, right? It's like saying, I don't want to say, oh, one thing is more, it's very hard to say which mitzvah is more important. But for example, if I have a beautiful house and I love my house, but if I don't have a foundation, the house would crumble. On the other hand, if I have a foundation, but I don't have a house, I'll have nowhere to live, right? So it's not a question of what's more important. It's a question is what's first, what's the foundation, what can you build upon? And you have to build upon being a mensch. You have to build upon kindness. Like I said, the sages say, Derech Eretz, the way of the world. In simple Yiddish, it's be a mensch. Being a mensch precedes the Torah. And that's why perhaps the story of Eliezer is emphasized to highlight that what makes us a people more than anything else is the kindness. That's the foundation of our peoplehood. And that's one interpretation. But you also want some mysticism, because if I didn't scare you away with the cave of Machpelah means, if anyone's still on this call, means you like Kabbalah. So we'll go a little bit more Kabbalistic and explain as follows. What is the story of what is the story of the servant about? What is this about? Again, if you have all this story, all this negotiation, right? We got this from the beginning of the Parsha. Negotiation means resistance. If it takes Abraham 10 verses to pay the guy to give the check, it means they don't want to give the check. In other words, they don't want to sell, right? So when you have all the verses, it means there's resistance that we have to overcome. And that's what we offer two interpretations, the political interpretation and the spiritual interpretation. But the bottom line is there's spiritual resistance. There's resistance. Now, multiply that many times in the story of Abraham, of Eliezer trying to convince Rebekah's father and family, first father, then brother. It's another whole story where the father disappeared too. But Eliezer is trying to influence Rebekah's family to send Rebekah with him back to a foreign land. They'll never see her again. And therefore, it has to be repeated because he's speaking to them. He's trying to influence them. There's resistance. And all those verses in the Torah are here to say, this is a big story. It's not so easy. It's not just a match. We have to find a girl for a guy. No, there's much more at stake here. And that's why we have to keep saying the story and how they were convinced and how they were influenced. And what's the big resistance? So simple, you say they don't want to send their girl away from Haran to Israel, from Iraq and Turkey to Israel. They're never going to see their daughter again. So there's resistance, and they have to be persuaded. And you need all those verses to show that there's difficulty, this challenge that has to be overcome. That's a simple interpretation. They don't want to send their daughter away. Okay, but she's not the only daughter that traveled, right? Most of us have grandparents that came here alone. See if I can get this right. My great-great-grandmother came here alone. Her name was Rebecca, actually, Rivka. She came here alone probably in the 1880s, and she was 16. She came alone. And okay, it's not the only. Rebecca's not the only one that traveled. So what's happening here? So spiritually, what we're saying here as follows. Spiritually, according to the Kabbalah, there are this story, this episode of the marriage of Isaac and Rebecca represents everything that the Torah is here to do. In other words, this is a metaphor for the entire purpose of the Torah. And that's why it gets so much attention. Why is it the metaphor for the entire Torah? Because this is the first marriage that we read about in the Torah. I mean, we do read how Adam married Eve, so to speak, how God took Adam, created Eve for Adam and put the two together. But that is a match made in heaven, pun intended. Match made in heaven. God made that match. Where is the first marriage? I mean, other people were married before. Noah was married, and everyone had children. Everyone was married. But the Torah does not discuss the marriage. The first marriage the Torah discusses is this marriage, Isaac and Rebecca. And the reason why it takes all that space is because the concept of marriage is a metaphor for everything we're doing on this world. Because marriage is not just marriage between male and female, between husband and wife. That's that too. But that's a metaphor for the marriage of God and the Jewish people. God is the groom, the Jewish people are the bride, and what we're doing here is we're bridging two entities from two different cultures and making them one. So we're not just taking Rebecca from the idol-worshipping Haran, and Isaac, the son of Abraham, who's willing to offer himself as a sacrifice, and putting the two together and making them one, taking two extremes and making them one. That too, but that's a symbol for our mission on this earth, that we connect the spiritual element and the physical element. We connect God and the Jewish people. And in some sense, every mitzvah is a part of this marriage. The Mishnah says that the day the Torah was given was the marriage between God and the Jewish people. So every mitzvah we do, every transaction we do based on the Torah, it's intensifying the marriage. So marriage is not a simple matter. Marriage is really critical to our understanding of what our mission in life is. And therefore, the Torah gives you all these details because it's telling you that this marriage represents the marriage of heaven and earth, the marriage of God and the Jewish people. And therefore, it's critical, but it's also difficult. And therefore, there's resistance, and therefore, the resistance has to be overcome. So now we have our work. I think it's 67 verses. We have to go through verse by verse and figure out how this helps our marriage, both our marriage to God and our marriage to our spouse. It's the same idea because one is a reflection of the other. So the good news is it's 10:58, so I have 2 minutes left. So you're only going to have to hear me preach for 2 more minutes. But I'll give you one little tidbit that is only small because it takes up one little verse, but it's really significant. And it tells us everything, in some sense, it tells us everything we need to know about marriage. So let's try to find this verse, and I'm going to try to do it quickly. I may go a minute or two overtime. So if you have to check out at 11, that's okay. I'm not going to get offended. Don't worry. Okay, you have to know that when Eliezer made his deal and he realized that Rebecca is the one who is going to be, who's the kind one that should be taken as, that should be the wife for Isaac, first thing he does, even before he asks her name, he's so sure that God sent him the right girl, he comes to her, the first thing he does, he gives her jewelry. And then he asks you what her name was. Now, lest you be curious, what jewelry did she give him? Right? I know if you would study the Torah, and I would say that he gave her jewelry, and I wouldn't tell you what jewelry she got, you would say, oh, I'm missing something important. But the Torah, I'm only saying I'm being sarcastic, but the Torah wants you to know exactly what type of jewelry she got. Not only that, the Torah wants you to know how much the jewelry weighed. What's the message? Of course, if you want a good marriage, buy jewelry. No, I'm joking. I'm not joking, actually. So I'm reading the verse. I'm reading chapter 24, verse 22. And it was, And it was when the camels had finished drinking, the man took a golden nose ring. Its weight was a beka, and 2 bracelets on her arms. 10 gold shekels was their weight. So he gives 2 bracelets. Each one weighs 10 gold shekels. And then he gives a nose ring that weighs a beka. I don't know what a beka is, but it weighs a beka. What do I need to know all of this? I need to know all this. So Rashi says, look, it's all allusion to what's going to happen later. When it says he gave her 2 bracelets, what does 2 remind you of later in the story? We have 2 tablets. I know there's 10 commandments, but there's 2 tablets. So 2 tablets is the 2 bracelets. The verse says that the 2 bracelets weighed, how much did they weigh? They weighed 10 gold coins. Oh, so you have 2 that weigh 10. 2 tablets, 10 commandments, easy. So he was really giving her an illusion to say, you come into this family, here's the jewelry. The jewelry represents our real treasure is not the physical jewelry, but it's the 10 commandments. Okay. What does he say before? He gives her a nose ring. What does the nose ring weigh? It weighs a beka. What's a beka? Says Rashi, search through all the mitzvot of the Torah, you'll find a mitzvah that has a beka. What's a beka? A beka is that later on in the story, it says that each person was commanded to give a half a coin to the temple. And they can take all those half coins and they use it for the temple. Now, and the half coin is a beka. The half coin weighs a beka. Now, what's a half coin? So there the Torah says like this. The Torah says a coin weighs, each person gives a half a coin. A coin weighs 20 gera. You give 10 gera. You give half of that. It becomes the question, why are we emphasizing? So we have many questions on this. We don't have a lot of time. Bottom line is the mitzvah of half shekel is critical to understand what marriage is. Marriage between us and God, marriage between spouses, physical spouses as well. What does this mean? Why does the Torah say half? We're never supposed to do half. We're also always supposed to seek to do whatever we do for God to do complete. You do a mitzvah, do it with the best possessions you have. The law says if you have a loaf of bread on Shabbat and you want to open the loaf of bread, you have a loaf and a slice. Don't eat the slice. Don't be efficient. Open the loaf because the loaf is complete. We're always looking to be complete. All of a sudden here, you're giving to the temple, you give a half a coin. So the commentaries explain half a coin is critical because a half a coin tells you that you're not complete without your relationship with God. You have 10, the whole is you and God as a whole. You are only half on your own. So you give half, but you do have to give your entire half. And that's what the verse says. There are 20 gera on the shekel, but you give 10. We know every person has 10 sfirot. 10 sfirot means your entire makeup of your soul powers. You have to invest all your entire essence. But that entire essence is only a half. And when you realize your half, then you'll seek out your other half, and your other half is, in the context of the story of the half shekel, the other half is God. But the same thing is with physical marriage, because physical marriage is a reflection of the spiritual marriage. How is the marriage going to work? If you have 2 parties that want to get married, and each person says, look, I'm complete, I don't really need you. Okay, it's nice, you're a nice person, why don't you come live together, we'll save on taxes, and we'll save on rent, right? That's not a marriage. Why not? Because each person feels themselves as whole on their own. A healthy marriage, the only way marriage could work is if each person realizes, I'm only half. And I need the other person to make me whole. People don't like to acknowledge that because that means I'm vulnerable. It means that I need you. Nobody likes to say I need you, but that's the truth. Now, not because I need you, I'm dependent on you. It's not interdependency, which is not healthy, because I have my full 10 capacities. I have my 10 sfirot. So I'm a full person and I can invest myself fully and I could survive without you. But I'm not wholesome without you. So that's the paradox here. I'm giving my full half. And I give my full half to God, and I give my full half to my spouse, to my marriage. And that's why this story is so important, because marriage, both marriage to God and marriage to another person, to a spouse, is difficult, it's challenging, it takes time, it takes work, it takes effort, it takes more words in the Torah than to tell us many of the laws of the Torah. So that's the story in short. Unfortunately, the time ran out, but a lot more to say. But if anyone has any comments or questions, please share. Otherwise, have a wonderful day, and hope to see you in good health